Immigration in the Netherlands is booming, and it poses a threat to the economy. In 2022, this peaked as 403,000 people entered the country, the highest in recorded history. That was 223,000 more people than entered the country than left in that year, equivalent to 1.5% of the population. Roughly 1 in 4 people living in the Netherlands were either born abroad or come from a non-native background, as previously relaxed immigration laws and a generous welfare state have made it a popular destination for migration from abroad. This rapid increase has led to decisions like this. December 2023, and the Netherlands is in shock. Controversial right-wing politician Geert Wilders' Party for Freedom had just won 37 seats in the country's 150-seat legislature, the largest single bloc, with one issue being at the centre of his campaign and Dutch media for many months: immigration. The Netherlands, like other EU states, has always had a fairly open stance to immigration, allowing for the free movement of people between other member states. But over the last decade, this pro-immigration attitude has started to sour. The rise of politicians like Wilders has given a voice to those opposed to migration, and support for Wilders and his anti-immigration stance has been growing in line with rising migration levels. The spike caused in 2022 was largely made up of people from the former Soviet Union and Ukraine, refugees seeking asylum as a consequence of the Russian invasion earlier that year. However, Wilders and his supporters have focused their stance on immigration from non-EU states, particularly majority Muslim nations, like Morocco and Syria. These are groups which have statistically higher welfare dependency and crime rates than other groups of migrants. But despite this, employment amongst all migrants is increasing, and they help fill labour shortages and grow the Dutch economy. However, wages have remained stagnant for well over a decade, despite an increase in housing prices which have quadrupled in the last 30 years. This, paired with soaring inflation, has fueled a bitter cost of living crisis. As this grows, many angered citizens and politicians are laying the blame on migrants as the root cause of the economic troubles. So this asks the question: is immigration really the problem with the Dutch economy, or is it something else? It's worth noting that overall support against immigration isn't necessarily growing, but instead, previously polarised anti-immigration groups have become more unified under leaders like Wilders. Despite this, his party has still been unable to form a coalition in the Dutch government. Years of ineffective policy has led to a poor integration of migrants, fueling growing discontent, not just among parties further to the right, like Wilders, but also in centrist parties like the VVD, who have started to take a more restrictive approach. Immigration in the Netherlands has not always been so divisive, and the current situation has its roots in the period following World War II. In the aftermath, the Dutch economy saw unprecedented levels of growth. Migrants were needed to occupy growing vacancies in low-skilled jobs, and as such there was a large influx from Europe, Turkey and Northern Africa. At this time, Dutch policy did not seek to integrate migrants into society and allowed migrants to hold on to their own culture by allocating state funds for different migrant groups to set up ethnic infrastructure like media and education. This was based on one assumption: that immigrants were simply coming in to fill temporary labour shortages and that they would leave in around 5 to 10 years. However, in the 1980s it became apparent that this was not the case, as more people from Turkey and Northern Africa joined for family reunification with these previously temporary labour migrants who had gained citizenship. This persisted, and family migration was the biggest factor for new arrivals for 30 years until the early 2000s. Migrants tended to be concentrated in more densely populated areas like Amsterdam and Utrecht, areas which already had higher levels of both unemployment and crime. As time continued, concern was raised about the polarisation of Dutch society between those with immigrant and non-immigrant backgrounds, leading to the formation of parallel societies, thanks in part to the policies set up in the 1960s which discouraged integration. In the 2000s, a shift was undertaken to make more effort to integrate migrants into Dutch society, as well as implementing tougher immigration laws. Despite this, immigration into the Netherlands has continued to increase in line with polarisation. So why is it that these groups believe that immigration is bad for the Netherlands and its economy? The economic concerns of these parties can be boiled down into a few areas: the threat to the labour market, an increased strain on public finances by claiming benefits and using other public resources, an increase in the risk of terrorism and crime, and of course perhaps the most prominent issue of late, a shortage of housing, which is feeding into the country's cost of living crisis. This is perhaps the most significant effect, and one being cited by many politicians, but more on this later. Firstly, taking jobs and placing an increased strain on public services. In 2022, immigration to the Netherlands was primarily made up of those from European nations. The income sources of these individuals shows over half of those entering from Europe enter the workforce within a year, and this rises to more than 2/3 in 5 years. This is by far the largest source of income for those from within the European Union, followed closely by those in education. The majority of these migrants from Europe rely very little on state benefit or pension payments, and in fact increase the economic output and human capital accumulation in the Netherlands. These new migrants tend not to compete directly with Dutch nationals for jobs. Instead, they are often used to fill existing vacancies and combat any labour shortages. Migration is needed in many high-skilled jobs, as there simply isn't enough skilled workers in the Dutch labour pool to occupy these vacancies. So rather than taking jobs, they're actually helping create them. However, clear differences emerge when we look at the income sources for migrants outside the EU. Despite being the minority, they tend to have a greater reliance on the welfare state, especially within the first few years of their arrival, putting pressure on the sustainability of the current Dutch welfare system. The nature of arrival for those outside the EU is heavily linked to both asylum and family reunification, both of which are less conducive with labour market participation. Both these groups, particularly asylum seekers, face much greater difficulty entering the labour market compared to other migrants, due to a lack of relevant skills and language level. This paired with the current admission process means they face greater difficulty accessing jobs, and the jobs available tend to be poorly paid and with low job security. For this reason, the employment rate of refugees 2 years after arrival is around 25%, compared to 55% for family migrants and 90% for labour migrants. And this state dependency is not a temporary effect, it persists across generations. And difficulty finding employment is of course directly correlated to dependency on the welfare state, meaning around 30% of Turkish and Moroccan first-generation immigrants receive welfare benefits, compared to around 12% for the Dutch population. Much of this has been influenced by Dutch policy of the past, which was less selective regarding the skills of new immigrants and also discouraged integration into the Dutch society up until the 1990s, meaning the development of language skills and qualifications, both critical for job success, were severely limited. Low wages and high levels of unemployment are unfortunately conducive with an area which is damaging for the Dutch economy: higher rates of crime amongst some immigrant groups. This effect tends to be higher with former Dutch colonies in the Caribbean, who have been observed to have higher crime rates than the native Dutch population, despite the general trend in falling crime rates of all backgrounds in the last 20 years. High crime is of course not beneficial to any society, requiring greater spending on law enforcement and generally creating an environment that isn't conducive to growth and investment. However, it's crucial to recognise that this is not an inherent trait of these communities, but rather a consequence of the barriers that they face in achieving full social integration. Further policies focused on initial integration after arrival and developing language skills and qualifications would help to mediate these effects, as migrants can access more and higher paying jobs. Much emphasis is placed upon the perils of non-EU migration by Wilders and those with an anti-immigrant stance. However, the majority of Dutch migration continues to be made up from those within the EU, who either enter the workforce or some form of education directly after entering, contributing to economic growth. Immigration is also necessary for the future of the Dutch economy to tackle their ageing population. The demographics of the Netherlands here show how the largest age groups are those in or nearing the age of retirement, and with fewer younger people to replace these jobs, the overall Dutch labour force will begin to shrink. A smaller workforce of course means less potential for future growth, but it also presents a problem for the current pension system, which is primarily funded by taxes on those already working. To keep Holland on its previous trajectory that it's accustomed to, a greater influx of migrants is required. Despite an economic need for migration, the Netherlands is the most densely populated country in Europe above 1 million people, and their increasing population is beginning to place a lot of strain on their housing market. Consequently, immigration is now the main source of population growth, and this presents an issue. Where are these people going to live, and how does it affect existing Dutch citizens and their housing prospects? Over the last 10 years, house prices have doubled. Conversely, the number of immigrants per annum in the past decade has been higher than at any time in the previous century. This has led many to draw the conclusion that migration is the sole reason for the housing crisis. But is it really as simple as that? Greater migration has undoubtedly pushed up housing prices, as it simultaneously increases the demand and lowers the supply of housing, which will cause an inevitable house price increase. However, much more emphasis should be placed on the lack of effective planning around housing policy from the Dutch government. As we have seen, migration is necessary for Dutch economic growth. However, in anticipating this, the government has taken inadequate measures to house migrants. The abolition of the Ministry for Housing, Urban Planning and Environment in 2010 and a law in 2016 allowing 2-year rental contracts allowed rents to skyrocket, and the absence of a dedicated ministry meant that focus was turned away from low and middle income housing, instead to commercial investors who focused more on expensive properties, driving prices up. The decline of elderly homes and an increase in international students has also placed greater strain on the market. As a consequence, the supply of housing in the Netherlands has not been enough to meet the current influx of migration. Migrants are certainly playing a factor in driving up housing prices, but considering they are vital for the economy, perhaps more onus should be placed on previous governments for not increasing the supply of affordable housing as opposed to migrants themselves. But instead, they are often used as the scapegoat for all these problems. It now seems as well that this will be even harder to make effective policy for the future, as the coalition between Wilders' Party for Freedom would undoubtedly lead to slower legislature. Immigration in the Netherlands is a complex issue, and one which will continue to be at the forefront of Dutch politics for many years to come. Immigration is crucial and needed for the economic longevity of the nation. However, continuing at its current rate and without policy reform will be unsustainable.